For those of you who don't know me, today we're going to talk about Drupal's Field API. I've liked the way the last few interviews have done a lot of hands up, so hands up here who's used the Field API to build a site, and hands up here who's written a module to provide fields and widgets for a site. Okay, so we've got a few, that's good. I want to talk about what this is to start with. This is about writing modules, and those that were here for the Views API talk beforehand, you would have heard the previous presenters talk about. This isn't about using the field UI. This isn't about point and click configuration. This is about coding. That said, if you're not a coder, as with the last presentation, if you are involved in estimation or similar, to know what's happening behind the scenes and what you can do with the Field API, then this will also be of interest to you. There is some assumed knowledge here, so we're assuming you know what a hook is, and you know what a module is, and you know how to go about writing one. And yeah, we're not about how do you add a field to a content type or a profile or anything like that. So just everyone's got the right room. Yeah, I'm seeing nods. Okay. I'm Lee Rowlands. On Drupal.org, you might know me as LA Rollins. I hang around in Drupal AU IRC when I'm at work, which is often long days. Do we get 2 slides then? Oh no, this is the summary. Hang on, slow down. So this is what I'm going to talk about today, right? We're going to talk about a bit of history and a bit of terminology. There's nothing worse than jumping in headlong and I'm talking about things that haven't really explained what they are. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of the Field API and when you would use it and when you wouldn't. And then we'll talk about the 3 main structures of the Field API, which are fields, widgets, and formatters, and hence the name. And if we get time, we might also look at creating fields in code. I've split the talk up, like the last one, into large chunks. Depending on how we go for time, we may not get the last one in. If you've got any questions, there'll be a break after each of those chunks where you can ask those questions. So if you could just, when you do have a question to ask, put your hand up and the man with the mic will come over so they can get it for the recording. So about us, Rollins Group is my company. There's myself and Nick over here. Put your hand up, Nick. Yeah. We're specialist Drupal developers. We used to do a bit of everything, but as of about 2.5 years ago, we just do Drupal. And we're based out of subtropical Queensland and officially Moore Park Beach. And that's just glazed looks, where's that? But basically, it's half an hour north of Bundaberg, which is about a 4.5 hour drive north of Brisbane. And with that little juxtaposition for the top of Fraser Island and the south of the Great Barrier Reef, we get surf, we get beautiful weather. If you want to move there, yeah, it's the best place in the world. Very lucky. Myself personally, I've been around Drupal since 4.7 days. I used to work for Bundaberg City Council, and as did Nick, and we were very lucky in that it was largely open source, Red Hat for the servers, and Drupal for just about everything, including the council's website, long before other councils were even looking at Drupal. And so we were both very lucky to get exposure to Drupal in early days. Everything from monitors in the foyer with news tickers and weather and announcements on, when your dog and cat had to be registered. And so I came to Drupal with an Uber card, particularly in a personal sense, and started up working as a lot of people do, freelance, and ended up becoming a career. And yeah, if you check me out on Drupal.org, last count I think it was 20-something modules we maintain, and I even stuck my hand up to be the maintainer of Forum in Core during the Make Core Maintainable issue, which I don't know if anyone followed that. Hands up if you're familiar with the Make Core Maintainable issue. Yeah. So we put our hand up there, and yeah, I mean, Drupal's our livelihood, so it's in our best interest to look at the continued success of it. Okay, what is the Field API? It's the module formerly known as CCK in Drupal 6, and it's obviously core in 7 now, and I'm assuming everyone here knows what it is, but the key terms we want to talk about here are field type, and so when you create a field, you choose a boolean or a list field or an integer field, so they're your field types. You create a field, so when you first put a field into a Drupal site, the first time you create that form, you're creating the field and you're also creating the instance. When you create further instances of that field, so, for example, you go to the Manage Fields section for an entity and you choose, okay, I want to reuse an existing field. what you're doing there is you're creating another instance. So we're clear on that terminology? What's a field and what's an instance, right? Hands up who knows what a bundle is, okay. This one has probably caused a lot of confusion, but basically in the node world, a bundle is each of the node types, so page, story, etc. And yeah, it's not a type, it's not an entity type. In that case, the entity type is node and the bundles are page, story. So it is, I think half the confusion has come because of the use of the word type, whereas everyone was used to talking about content types. So in the instance of, say for example, profile 2, hands up who's familiar with profile 2. Yeah, you create multiple bundles of profile 2 when you create each of your profiles, your types, you know, so you might have one for different use cases. Anyone familiar with commerce, Drupal commerce? Yeah, you know, you can have product types. I'm seeing some nods, yeah. Each product type is a bundle. And so the peculiar thing about a bundle is that's where you define your fields. And then of course the widget is the, yeah.
Can you explain that a bit more in terms of bundle, more like a group of fields?
The question was, is a bundle like a group of fields? And in essence it is yes.
Or field property? Or
No, it's a bundle of fields. I've got, if you look at, say, for example, the content types, each content type is a bundle, right? Bundle is the term used in the code, it's used in the doc, it's used in the API. If you think content type, you'll be right, you know what I mean? And then widget, we know what a widget is, right? It's the same representation of the different form element for the same field. Classic example, say the taxonomy term reference field, you can have autocomplete or a drop down or checkboxes. You know, they're different instances of a widget for that particular field. Okay, so why use the field API? Well, first of all, it's damn flexible, and if you want to change, you know, elements of your site, you know, and your storage, etc., you can do that. I mean, I suppose a show of hands, who's aware that there's other storage modules for the field API? But yeah. Some of those include Mongo. There's one that's under development, which is per bundle storage. And basically, the storage of the field data and the actual field interface are decoupled as of Drupal 7. And so, you know, you can build your site with another backend without having to worry about the database. But the big one for me is the reusable components and reusable logic. If you've got particular business logic that you can encapsulate in a form element and you need it for multiple entity types or you need it for multiple bundles, then yeah, the field API is the way to go there because it's transferable. The views integration is nice. I mean, we spoke about the last one about implementing hook views data. If you went the custom route, you'd have to do that all on your own. And then the widgets is a nice add as well. We'll get to this later, but you can have your own set of schema, and which is your fields in the database, but you can use different forms with the same data in the background, which then gives you, when you get to views, you can have group by queries and etc. that run over two disparate sets of data that are entered in a different format, but the same database structure in the background, and that means your queries are a lot simpler. Okay, so this is the way we used to do things. You would implement hook node API. Who's familiar with hook node API? Which was the Drupal 6 way. Drupal 7, it's all hook node update, hook node insert, etc. So you're looking at a lot of hooks. You've got to do a form alter to add the fields. You've got to do the database handling yourself, including, you know, all four of the CRUD operations, and you need to write your own views integration. And yeah, who's ever had to theme fields that have been added via hook API? Like UberCart, for example, which was, you know, like you, back in UberCart Drupal 6, you had your SKU, your price, and all of those fields that didn't go via the field API, and the theming of those was always difficult. Going through the field API, it's a completely homogeneous, the same all the way through for all your fields. And so those of you that are familiar with Drupal Commerce will note that just about every field that's associated with, say, a product or a line item or an order runs through the field API. So where do you start? You want to define a field type. Get your basic module going, install file, module file, and you implement hook info, hook field info, sorry. Now, after I proposed this talk, we had to write a simple field handler for the commerce recurring module, which we worked on. And I'm going to get some, can that be read from there, or you want a bigger font size? Okay. And so this is one of the modules that we had to write, which is the interval field. Now, the interval field is available on drupal.org/interval, not surprisingly. And what it gives you is a simple little field here where you can say, okay, every 3 months. And through the admin UI, you can say weeks, days, years. And so it's a very simple thing, but yeah, surprisingly, there was nothing doing that. So luckily, knowing I had this talk coming up, we can use that module as an example. So yeah, implementing hook field info. So we're saying we provide a field type called interval, and we've got a nice description and default widget, default formatter. Very simple. Okay, now we have to tell Drupal what we want it to store. Now this is a very simple example because we're really only storing the two fields that you saw there. The interval and the period. So to do that, we have to implement hook field schema. Now, you can have one field module that defines multiple field types. You saw in that code before we were returning an array. And so when you implement hook field schema, you get past the field argument, and that lets you decide which columns apply to that field type. And look, nothing tells a story better than an example. So here's a hook field schema for that. And so who's familiar there with hook schema? Pretty much everyone? Yeah. It's the same sort of thing, just on a micro level. So rather than defining each of the columns in your table, you just define the ones that your field cares about. And this was what Drupal will use to create tables like field data, field blah, field revision, field foo. Are people familiar with what the data structure in the database looks like for the field API? It's one table for every field, and it's got references to the entity and the entity ID. And you'll notice that it puts a couple of extra columns on the end, and that's what we're defining here. And in this example, we're not using this field argument. Okay, so next step along the process is to let it know what widgets you define. Now, you may not define your own widgets. The two are, you can define a widget without a field type, and you can define a field type without a widget. I'll talk more about that later. But obviously, when you want to reuse something that already exists, that's obviously the best way to do things. Don't reinvent the wheel, and that's what you can do with that. But in this case, we have our own widget, and I'll just find it. So we implement hook field widget info, and we have just one widget, interval default. But we could provide many varied widgets if we wanted to. And later on, I'll show a bit more complex example of the kind of stuff that you can do. But yeah, pretty straightforward. What's the label? What's the field types? And so if we go into the actual field API itself, which I'm not going to bother, but basically everyone knows how to create a field. When you choose the field and the widget, you'll see interval and period as the widget type. All right, field settings. So, when you create a field and you add it to your bundle, the second step will show you field settings. And so, for example, with the date fields, you'll get whether you want to store it in the granularity, such as whether you want to store seconds, minutes, hours, etc. With the image field, you're putting in things like the file size. Yeah, we know what I'm talking about here. Yeah. So to do that, you have to implement hook field instance settings forms, which is to provide settings for an instance, and hook field settings form, which is to provide global settings for a field. Contrast between the two, date is another good example. With the date module, when you define a date field, right at the very start, you have to define whether or not it, the granularity and the time zone handling, etc., because that influences the field schema and the database structure. And those things, generally, you can't change them after the field's been created. On the other side of things, the instance settings form is the one that you're probably most used to. And you'll probably find a lot when you're creating fields that after you add the field, the second step will say there are no settings for this field type. Anyone? Yeah, we've all seen that. Yeah, well the first form is the field settings, and the second form, which is where you get to do stuff, is the instance settings. So another simple example. I just went past it before. Okay, so this is our instance settings form. So for this one, this interval one, we're allowed to choose our allowed periods. So in the one I showed you before, I could just enter the number of months, but when you set the field up, you can give the user a chance to choose between months, weeks, days, years, etc. And so that's all we're doing there. We're getting our intervals, and we're showing you, using the form API, a series of checkboxes. Nothing too fancy there. So I just might have a quick recap. Has anyone got any questions so far? Good. Okay. Now we have to actually handle the entity form. So up to now we've done the admin side of things, which is what you do as part of your building process. From here, now we actually start entering content or creating users or creating products, and so we start talking about the form that the end user will see. And so you implement a hook field widget form, and so the form is specific to the widget. Obviously, it doesn't impact on the field itself. And I've got a bit of a niggling point on this. Is there's one hook for the whole thing, and if your module defines multiple field types, multiple widgets, it all goes through this one function. Hence the huge number of arguments. I'll see if I can get this all in one page. Yeah, we're kind of not. They're going to have to scroll on you. But basically what you're doing here is you're inspecting the form state, which is one of your arguments, which you can't see off the page. You're inspecting the field, you're inspecting the instance, and you're actually rendering using the form API the fields that you want to show for that widget based on a combination of arguments. If this one looks involved, you should see some of the more complicated ones where you've got 3 or 4 different field types going through the one module, and it gets quite convoluted. Yeah.
You could always just define your own separations.
Yes, of course. And I would advocate doing that, putting them in their own, obviously for memory and performance issues, but it doesn't apply to this.
Much the same as formatters, where they previously each had their own theme function. Now they all have a formatter view function where you have to do exactly the same thing as that.
And that's the classic example. So I'm not going to go into detail what this form does, but basically it's just showing those two little, it's a very simple example, showing those two little fields, one to enter the number of months and one to choose the period. Okay, so now, same as with every form API function, when you build the form, then you have to validate it. So there's two that go hand in hand here. It's hook field validate and hook field widget error. And now there's a pretty good design pattern for handling these. And if you look at, say, the example fields module or any of the other modules defined by core, do it the way they do it, unless you've got some particular use case. But because the two-stage process, I'll just find the functions. First one's you validate. And so all we're doing here, similar to the last examples in the view section, we're just making sure they put a numeric value in the first field. And there's no point in them putting in G months. We want to make sure they put in a number. And so what we do is we set this errors object. And if I can get rid of the... Further on down, we actually handle responding to that errors object. Just passed to us there, and we're just using form error. Now this is the standard implementation. Most of the field modules do it, and yeah, there's no point reinventing the wheel there. You set your errors in that format, and then you use your form set error in the error handler, in the hook field widget error. Now, most cases you probably don't need to handle submission. So, I mean, you can obviously using the API, but I'm not going to talk about that today because by and large the storage handlers handle that for you. And if you start implementing your own logic in there and someone wants to, not use the SQL backend for storage, then you could find yourself that your code is not completely portable. But the one thing you do have to tell Drupal is the field actually populated. So when you get classic example is the unlimited cardinality. You know, you have multiple values, and so, you know, how does it know which one's actually been populated and which ones aren't? And so you have to implement hook field is empty. In the case of this, a simple example again, we're only really looking to make sure they've populated the first one, which is the value field. Obviously, the select field is always going to be set, and we don't want it to store, you know, an empty value if we're using it in a multiple value setup. And so, yeah, you implement hook field is empty and let Drupal know when someone's actually entered something. Very simple example there, but I'll talk about a more complex one if we get time later. So, quick recap again. Anyone got any questions before you keep going? Alright, so to this point, we've defined the fields, we've handled the widgets, the form, and the data. We now go on to displaying it, and Stuart in the crowd here is an expert on this kind of stuff with custom formatters. But you implement hook field formatter info, and you let Drupal know about the way to format your data. Obviously, when you come through at the theming layer, people obviously want to be able to override this stuff as well, and projects like Stuart's custom formatters let people who aren't involved in the actual module intervene with the way the data is output, but the module itself have to define something at the base level so that your data is actually displayed. So yeah, another quick example. We're just saying the ways for us to output this data is interval default, just a plain, nothing fancy here. This module, there's obviously some scope to go a little bit further with formatters, but for the use case that we wrote it for, we just display it. In fact, most cases we hide it anyway. But yeah, like for example, with this, you could get funky and display a relative date. The person is entering an interval, you know, so 3 months, you could show 3 months from today or 3 months from a given date. So there is some scope here for additional formatters. And yeah, if anyone wants to get on board with that, get in touch, by all means. And then we actually come to the view part of it. And again, this is another one where it's a good idea to break up your output into multiple functions if you can, and if you are defining multiple formatters, multiple widgets, and multiple field types, because as we tested before, this could get very messy very fast given the large number of arguments that you pass there. In this case, we're just providing a simple div tag with the interval value in it. We're using the render array to return a render, the render API to return a render array. Everyone knows what the render API is? Yeah, I'm not hearing any arguments, so yeah. And basically, I mean, that sort of doesn't go to any markup until the very last moment if possible. And if you have to attach JavaScript or CSS to your output, you always make sure you use the hash attached property. Is everyone familiar with hash attached that came in Drupal 7? Instead of using Drupal add CSS and Drupal add JavaScript, which aren't safe in certain case circumstances, you use hash attached, and you actually attach the CSS and the JavaScript to the elements, and then yeah, things that used to break with caching enabled tend to work a lot better. Okay, I think this is what I was talking about before. You can define a field without a widget, vice versa. Taxonomy module is a good example. It implements hook field widget info alter, and so these are now we're starting to get into the field info API, and it basically says, okay, the options module also defines a widget for taxonomy term field type, and so rather than reinvent a widget, when all it is a select list, which is already provided by the options module, it just says, well, options module also handles my widget, and then it says implements hooks options list, and based on the options for that field type, such as the vocabulary, it'll populate the options list, which is obviously the terms. And so, yeah, in the typical Drupal fashion, don't reinvent the wheel where you don't need to. Okay. I apologise for the number of recaps in this project, in this presentation, but I didn't know how long it was going to go for, so I've got multiple exit points. We're going all right for time. We've got plenty of time. Okay. So from here we're going to go into the field info and the CRUD APIs. The field info it's part of the field API, but it's kind of more of an informational element of it. So it's how you query, Drupal, tell me what field types there are, what fields are defined, what instances are there, what widgets can I use. And so I've thrown up about 6 or so there, but field info field types will tell you what types are defined, Is there a boolean? Is there a commerce order reference field? Is there a product reference field? Field case clear will make sure that your field info field types gives you the most up-to-date value. So if you're, which we'll get to, I think we'll get to, if you're defining fields in code during an install function, before you go creating a commerce order reference, you want to make sure that the field cache knows about the commerce order reference field, because if that module was enabled as part of a dependency for your module, it may not know about it. So call your field cache clear first, and then to be super sure, you call field info field types to make sure that it's actually there. Another sort of companion function, entity info cache clear. If you're creating using the field API CRUD, you want to put an interval field on a product entity, right? You need to make sure that the bundle of that product entity actually exists, and or Drupal knows about it, and so you call it entity info cache clear to make sure that Drupal's up to date on what it's got available to it. Field info field is will give you information about a particular field that's available in your site. So say you define an image field on, you use the standard install profile and you get your field image on the page content type. Field info field will give you all the information you need to know about that field type, Field info instance will give you all the information you need to know about a particular instance of that field. So say you've got an image field which is on a page content type, a page bundle, and a story bundle. You can use field info instance to get the particular configuration for that instance on that bundle. And field get items, I'm assuming most people are familiar with field get items. Talk about it? No? Okay, right. When you're looking at a node object in Drupal 7, you'll see, say, node, field, blah, language none, or UND, some people might have seen, and then, the array of those. You use field get items to do the language safe fetching of those fields. So field get items will take the entity type, the actual entity, and the field name, and it'll return you the array for the correct, and the language, and it'll return you an array for the correct language. So there's no need to be doing node, is set, node field, yada, 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 all that sort of stuff. Field get items will return that safely for you. If we get time, we might talk a little bit about the entity module, because there's some even sweeter stuff than that you can do. Okay, so field create instance. These are how in code you add a field to a bundle. So, for example, when you set up Drupal Commerce, in the background, you may not be aware, but it's defining its own entity type, and when you create when you install Commerce Product UI module, it creates for you a product type, and it adds a price field, and it adds a currency field, and it does it with these field create field and field create instance. So whereas traditionally, if you had a module and you had some data that was associated with, say, a node type or some sort of entity, and you would have implemented the node API to add the fields to that to the form using the form alter, you can use these to add the fields that you require to the correct entity types and bundles at time of install. And so that will let you use the field API for all your custom fields that you need without having to, kind of, as soon as they install, the fields are there type functionality. Now I've got a large example of this, just bear with me. This is quite a large one, but in the install function for Commerce Recurring, it does a lot of. I've gone past it. of this kind of stuff. So putting together all the stuff we're talking about. Can everyone see this all right? Yeah. We were talking earlier about making sure we had all the right info. One of the things that the module sets up is an order reference, and so you have the parent order, and then you have the recurring orders that a child derived from that. And so as part of the module setup, we add an order reference from the child to the parent. And so doing that in code, we start off by making sure all of these exist. So we want to make sure that the commerce order reference field, the interval reference field, the interval field type, and the date stamp exist. If they don't, we clear the cache. We make sure we got the right entity info, and then we make sure the fields don't already exist. So field info field will tell us if our field exists, and if it doesn't, we create it. And then the same thing lower down for the instances. And so towards the bottom of this module, we just have got a nice wrapper function around all of the fields that it defines, so we don't have to use it. We can, like, reusable basically, because obviously when we uninstall our module, we want to make sure we delete those fields as well. So putting them in a nice encapsulated wrapper function to return all of our fields and instances lets us do it nice and easily. And so, yeah, these are what field create field is expecting to receive. It's expecting to receive a nice little array. And for those of you that use features, everyone who uses features here, you'll be familiar with this structure, or even going back to Drupal 6 when you did exporting of CCK fields, you would see, this kind of array with the details about a installed field, and then the same thing for the instance, which has just got further detail because it gives you all of the settings that are associated with that each instance. How are we going for time? How are we going for time? Plenty of time? Righto. Wow, I've gone early. Well, I've got plenty of time for questions. A lot of questions, yeah. If you want to find out more, api.drupal.org, obviously, and the examples module, which is a module that's been co-written by quite a few authors, and it actually includes a field example, and it's got working examples of all of these. I did have a more complex example of what you can do with the field API and why it's cool. This is, now, is everyone familiar with the field collection module? I might just talk a bit about it first. The field collection module defines a new entity type called a field collection, and then you attach fields to the field collection, and then you attach a field collection to another entity, and so what you can have is nested multiple fields. So if you can create, if you want a repeating form that has multiple fields in it, you can do that using field collection. The data storage at the back is a bit messy because it's one table per field, and then you've got multiple fields, and so the relationship between those fields is lost, but it's a very powerful module. It particularly makes a nice UI for entering repeated values where there's multiple fields for each. But it doesn't suit every use case, and so for a project that we recently worked on, is there anyone here from ChalkChip? Hey guys, how you going? We worked on a project with ChalkChip Multimedia out of Geelong, and yeah, one of the things that we worked on was the ability for adding attendees to a session, and in this particular use case, it didn't suit using field collection because the data had to be summarised. It had to be you needed to be able to access multiple fields from the same, I'll call it delta or the same row in the same query in views, and you can't. The field collection, they're more disparate, and also we needed custom logic around choosing a client, which relied on the sub-user module, which is where one user is a parent of other users, and so they only need to be able to select their sub-users. And so this is one of those widgets where you can pick, add another client, multiple rows, etc. Nice kind of thing that previously was only really possible through, your custom form handlers form API that you attach to a node or whatever entity. But in this case, yeah, you can do this kind of thing straight through the Fields API. So this is just a particular instance of a widget. There are multiple widgets of this that show and hide the various columns, but at the back end it's the same data structure, so that you can run one view across the whole lot, regardless of how the widgets. There is another one with a price column, and you saw before when you change the client, it goes off and does some Ajax. But yeah, there's another one of these widgets where you choose the client and it goes off and sets the price column based on that client's profile fields. And so that kind of custom logic around selecting a person's price, based on the user that was selected. It's something that you traditionally would have done a custom form handler before, but you can now do that through the field API. And what's better is that whole piece of logic is encapsulated now in a field. And if you need it on other elements or other entity types or other bundles, you've got that logic that you can basically, as simple as adding an image field to another entity type, you can add that to it. So it's very powerful and well worth the time to learn. But enough about that. Questions? Oh, hey, there's more. I just want to briefly touch on the entity module. If you haven't used it before, it is used heavily by Commerce module, and it, traditionally where you would do field get items to get the elements, it lets you do cool stuff like wrapper, make a wrapper around the node and go for each wrapper field foo as item and item value. It's beautiful object-oriented code. To set the value of a field, wrapper field foo equals 5. None of this wrapper field foo, language none, 0, value equals. It respects multiple cardinality. It's if you haven't used it, go and have a squid at it. And this kind of stuff is what's on the cards for Drupal 8. I don't know those of you following, but the node is becoming a first-class object, comment, etc. So rather than being node equals new standard class, it'll be node equals new node. And the whole thing will hopefully encapsulate a lot of this entity metadata and transversal stuff and make it a lot easier, the developer experience in particular. I'm finished this time. Any questions? Stone science.
If you've got a legacy schema
yes.
that you're trying to wrap up as fields so that you can get things like the view support for free and all that sort of stuff,
yes.
How do you go about that? You don't control the tables, you can't put them in.
Yes, there is an issue on Drupal in the issue queue at the moment, which sort of touches on that as well, in that field schema is hard-coded. Whereas with a normal module you have hook update in and you can update that field schema is pretty much set in stone unless that issue's been resolved. So you've got to think about it carefully, and it may, if you during development you decide to change stuff, you may need to do a bit of alter table type action. If you know that the fields that you need, I would implement hook field schema. I would create the fields either with the CRUD API or through the UI, and then I would migrate the data over. If you look at the tables, say you create a field called field foo, right? Drupal will create a table called field data field foo, and it'll create a table called field revision field foo. The structure of those are identical except for one's multiple revisions, obviously. A large degree of that data is, why don't I just show you? A large degree of the columns in that is provided by Drupal. Hang on. No, I'm not configuring my screen here. What are you doing, Sam? Good old. Yeah, you're right. A lot of these columns are provided automatically for you. So the hook field schema for this module would only define a product ID column, and the rest of this is provided by Drupal by the field API. So if you know that there's 2 or 3 fields that you need to record data in, You define those 3 fields. Drupal will handle the rest of that table structure for you when the field's created, and you populate the values that you need in there. Does that answer the question? No worries. Now, if there's no other questions, I might put a spruik in. While we're doing some recordings of Drupal voices from sort of Australia. So we're calling it Drupal Yarns, and if you have something that you might like to say or might like to have people hear, come up, introduce yourself, say hi, and we'll just quickly record it. And, where it's a chance to reach the wider Australian Drupal community and the Drupal community as a whole. Thank you.